And from InsideArabia.com, senior correspondent joining us now, Alessandro Bruno, and he's live in Toronto. Alessandro, great to have you with us, man.
Thank you, John.
Let's get to the story that you had up the other day, and I want to bring everybody's attention to it. The strategic implications of Bahrain and UAE's accords with Israel, and also we're going to talk about a little bit about how that's having no impact on the U.S. election whatsoever. Like, it's never even talked about, which is kind of amazing to me. I think the president would be highlighting this. He hardly mentions it. Nobody mentions it in the news media in the United States. But according to your piece, you said, according to the Abraham Accords aimed at normalizing Israel's diplomatic relations with the UAE and Bahrain and potentially other Gulf states, which is the goal here, they've achieved little in the way of peace. You say rather they allow for the war against Palestine nationalism to be pursued through other means and serve as a Trojan horse to seduce other Arab states with the promise of strategic and economic advantages. Can you elaborate on that, Alessandro? This is a pretty in-depth analysis that you think is just going to backfire or just going to harm the Palestinians.
Well, first of all, I think going back to what you said about the president, I think this is a major, the accords are a huge diplomatic achievement for the president and for his goals and for the people that he's representing. So I am surprised that he's not talking more about it, because this is what the JCPOA was to Obama. This is to Trump. It's a big deal. And, the reason it's a big deal is because and I call it a Trojan horse, but it has broken the taboo of the Palestinian issue. Now, for decades, no Arab state would even dare think of making a diplomatic overture to Israel until the premise was until there is a Palestinian state. But now, I think, particularly since the oil prices have gone down and they don't seem to be recovering, they needed to change strategy entirely and completely change their nature. And this accord has 2 states have joined in. But it doesn't surprise me that it's the UAE, which is a kind of. I'm writing another article. I'm comparing the UAE to the Venetian Republic of the Middle Ages, which was a small republic but extremely powerful because it was the biggest trading center of its time.
Right.
So they invented banks in Venice in that time. So I think the UAE is going to focus not so much on oil anymore. They're already many Gulf states are going back away from oil, and to become a major trade center. And to do that, they need to have relations with everybody in the region. So that was they started it. Bahrain second. There will be others eventually. And in an article that's coming up soon, you'll see. I suggest even Iraq could soon join that list, or at least there are the conditions for states that you'd never think of joining. Even Lebanon, there have been rumors of some kind of peace, because without oil, the Gulf states they cannot finance groups, and they cannot support social systems in Palestinian territories and other areas at risk. So they need to change strategy entirely. It's become a survival issue now.
So, where does this leave the Saudis, Alessandro?
Well, if the UAE, which is closely allied to the Saudis, made this deal, the Saudis are behind it, meaning they are in agreement with it. The problem is that Saudi Arabia is still the guardian of Mecca and Medina, the centers of Islamic faith. So they can't be. It's too early for them to join the deal, at least formally, with the ceremony. Informally, I'm sure they're in it. There have been contacts, as we know, more contact, in fact, between the Saudis and the Israelis than with the others. But they cannot be seen to show. They cannot show it yet. Also, Saudi Arabia has a much larger population than the UAE, and contrary to popular belief, there is poverty in Saudi Arabia. They do have a local poor scene, which could be susceptible to messages from fundamentalists and cause problems for the monarchy. So in order to keep things quiet and stable, they will not be the next one to join, even though they will give their blessing to any future deals within that sphere, in the, let's call it the Sunni sphere. Also, there's Turkey. Turkey is quickly replacing Saudi Arabia as the Muslim powerhouse, both ideologically and in finance terms. They're sponsoring various projects, and they're advancing their cause. I mean, let's not forget they symbolically Erdogan changed the Hagia Sophia, which was originally a cathedral built in 500 AD, 517, right, then turned to a mosque, and then converted to a museum by the secular president Atatürk in 1932, I think. Mm-hmm. And then now it's back into a mosque, even though it's still open to tourists. That was a very symbolic and important move, posing Turkey as the new champion of Muslim rights and aspirations. Saudi Arabia cannot afford to. It's still vying for that role.
You're on the John Fredericks Radio Network. We're with Alessandro Bruno, senior correspondent with Inside Arabia. Go to InsideArabia.com and bookmark that. Alessandro live in Toronto, Canada right now. His latest story, the strategic implications of Bahrain and the UAE's accords with Israel. Two questions, Alessandro. Number one is, you're right about Saudi Arabia. Even though they're not an active participant, they're an inactive participant, because we all know that Bahrain can't sneeze without getting MBS's approval. So obviously they gave them the nod before they went forward with this. Secondly, where does Egypt play out in all this? Egypt part of one of the blockade Gulf states in the siege on Qatar, one of four: Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Egypt. Where does Egypt fall into this whole thing now?
Well, Egypt,
especially as it relates to what you said about Erdogan and Turkey.
Well, actually, Egypt is one of the supporters of this move, because Egypt was the first state to make peace with Israel. The difference between Egypt and Bahrain and the UAE is that Egypt actually was at war with Israel. Two major wars in 1967 and 73, not to mention the ones in 48 and 56 and so on. But so in 1979, under President Carter, the Camp David Accords, Egypt and Israel made a formal peace. It's different than what this is, because this is not a peace deal, because they were never at war officially, UAE and Israel. It's a diplomatic recognition. The effects are the same, but formally they're different. So Egypt, in some ways, has gained, will have strengthened that alliance. It's under less threat than it ever was, because the Egyptians were always under previous administrations, Mubarak and Sadat, were still bound to the Palestinian cause. But under Sisi, this has eroded. In fact, just a few weeks ago, the Egyptian Navy shot and, I believe, killed one or two Palestinian fishermen off of Gaza. So they are much less confined to to the Palestinian cause, within the Palestinian cause, as they were before. And now they've gained formally some very powerful and rich allies. And Egypt needs powerful and rich allies in the Gulf. It's not in a position to take risks, diplomatic risks, because it gets a lot of U.S. aid because of the peace with Israel, over $3 billion a year, I think that was, and it's an important source of revenue for a country which is one of the most populous in Africa, and one of the most densely populated as well. So it's a win for Egypt, I think.
I agree with that, and of course, economically they're suffering now because of COVID, and their tourism is down, which is a big part of their
major problem.
Yeah, that's so they're struggling with that. In your piece, Alessandro, you said that Benjamin Netanyahu emerges as the biggest winner. Why?
Because he's had some personal legal problems in Israel. I mean, there are many who want him down in Israel itself, from both right and left. And not over foreign policy or even government policy, but more personal matters, taxes and other dealings. And also he's sharing power with Gantz. So he scored this diplomatic deal, and it's a very important point going in any eventual election. And he's delivered, he's given Israel two major, very rich and important allies across the Gulf. They are already sharing flights and tourism, and who knows what else will come of this. But also, as you will see perhaps in the next piece I write, this deal opens a breach. As I mentioned earlier, it's broken that Palestinian taboo. So more states will come in. He has achieved in a few weeks of diplomacy, in a few months, something that has taken years in attempts before without firing a shot. And also, he also wins, I think that was the point I was trying to make the most. He wins on a little bit on the left of Israel as well, because many on the left reject the outright annexation of the Palestinian territories. Netanyahu, by agreeing to this deal, one of the agreements is that they have to delay or avoid annexation of the West Bank entirely. So it just keeps the status quo. In effect, they have the settlements. On paper, there is still a separate West Bank. So it keeps the status quo without risking, because annexing the territories would be a huge undertaking, right, from many points of view. So that means he doesn't have to take that risk without making it seem as if it's a compromise. Sorry, we can't do that because we're gaining this diplomatic deal here, which is much more important. So he can transfer the responsibility to that deal, carrot and stick sort of thing. And I think politically this is a major chess move on his behalf.
I think you are so right here, Alessandro. I got to tell you, that's why I love reading your pieces. On the surface, everybody said that President Trump was the biggest winner, but really it's Netanyahu who's the big winner. And
yes,
the president,
Netanyahu,
as we said at the beginning, he's getting nothing from this politically. I mean, zero. It's amazing to me when you look at the remarkable progress he's had in the first flight that came over and everything else from Israel to UAE, and he's getting nothing. And but Netanyahu has played this. I mean, he is really the master politician. How this guy continues to survive, term after term, and still has so much authority and power. Now he's played this beautifully, and there's no two-state solution, right? I mean, that's not even in the dialogue now, right? It's just gone.
That's the thing. The accords have virtually eliminated this possibility, I think. there might one day be a one-state solution. Many Israelis don't want it because that would mean equating, but that many Palestinians, including those of the most left, or the most nationalist Palestinians, have also given up on the two-state solution. So this puts it in much bigger question than ever before. I mean, it's opened now the idea of Israel being allied to many of its neighbors. That taboo has broken. It's happening, and it could happen with the least states that you would never expect. Israel's biggest enemy in the Middle East right now is what used to be its biggest ally, Turkey, in many ways. And Turkey has relations with Israel. So
why would they be there? Why would Turkey,
down.
Alessandro, why would Turkey be their biggest threat? I mean, I get what you're saying about Erdogan and trying to get influence in there with the Palestinians, but they've been allies for a very long time.
Well,
and I mean, Turkey recognizes, their military power. They recognize the longstanding relationship. So why would Turkey be their number one source of concern?
Well, it's their number one ideological enemy, because who are Erdogan's allies in the Palestinian territories? Hamas, the Muslim Brotherhood. So it's Turkey is closely connected to Hamas, which is the much more than in the West Bank. Hamas is what's putting up some of the biggest resistance still these days in Gaza. Mm-hmm. And Erdogan has come out against this agreement, even though they've had diplomatic relations with Israel for years. But Erdogan plays many sides at once. Mm-hmm. As a reminder, just in the very weeks before the so-called Arab Spring erupted in Syria in 2011, Erdogan had friendly relations with President Assad in Syria. And actually, here's something that could come back into the fore. Few people remember or know that in 2010, Israel and Syria were holding secret talks in Turkey, to recognize each other. And that was ended by the Arab Spring. But
really?
Yes, under the time the Prime Minister was Tzipi Livni, who I think still has a position in cabinet, or certainly did in the recent Israeli government. Mm-hmm. But she was, and Prime Minister Olmert before her, they started to hold. They didn't meet directly, but there were high-level delegations in Istanbul and Ankara discussing better relations. And I mean, there are rumors that Lebanon, because Lebanon is divided in many pieces, there is a considerable amount of pressure from some groups in Lebanon to recognize Israel as well. So
Alessandro, fascinating discussion as always. Love having you on. Great piece. And
thank you.
Biggest thing I got out of this: Netanyahu emerges as the big winner. I never really thought of it in those terms, but you're right. The president getting no traction out of this, just amazing to me. No political traction, zero. And but Netanyahu once again maneuvers his way around. I mean, he got him to annex the Golan Heights. He got him to give him the other territory he needs. He got him to move the embassy. And Trump right now at risk of losing, getting nothing out of it. And Netanyahu once again emerges as the hero. It's the guy's unbelievable.
He was prime minister in '96.
It's unbelievable. I mean, there's got to be a book written on this guy. He's got to be the master politician of all time. But I think here's the other thing I agree with. He's met his match in Erdogan, because this guy also, like you said, he plays, what do they call it, Alessandro? Multi-dimensional chess at the same time. where you see it in the streets of Toronto when you got guys they're playing 5 games of chess simultaneously for money, and they always win. That's kind of where he is. And if you looked at the way Erdogan and his PR department in Turkey handled the Khashoggi death and the way they leaked that out on almost a daily basis and just completely manipulated the media. I mean, that was masterful the way they did that. A shame what happened to the journalist there, but that guy, Erdogan and Netanyahu, these have got to be the 2 best politicians of our time right now, no question. Great piece, very insightful. Alessandro, thank you. Thank you for being with us from Toronto. Thank you so much. John Fredericks Radio Network.